So after a rapid run-up in house prices in the Toronto area market due to COVID, over the past 4 months or so, we're in the summer of 2022 now, we've seen a relatively rapid decline in house prices, in particular in the suburban market. And when a lot of home buyers and sellers start to see, patterns like this that aren't typical for Toronto, we're used to seeing home prices rise rapidly, they try to make sense of it by looking at recent events in the past to understand what might happen in the future. And the most common thing I'm hearing from a lot of people right now is that the trends we're seeing on the ground in Toronto's market right now appear very similar to what we saw in 2017. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with Toronto's housing market, in 2015 and 2016, we saw a very rapid acceleration in home prices, very similar to what we saw during COVID, especially in the suburbs. And then in the beginning of 2017, the market slowed down rapidly, and it slowed down just as the province of Ontario had announced the foreign buyers tax. And that spooked a lot of people in the market because the BC government had done something similar a year earlier where they introduced the foreign buyers tax and it caused home prices to fall. So when the province of Ontario did it, it really kind of pulled a lot of buyers out of the market because they were worried prices were going to fall. It pushed a lot of sellers to list, and prices fell very dramatically. From about February or March of 2017 to the summer, prices fell about 15 to 20%. So the dynamics we're seeing in the housing markets today, if we look at sort of this COVID period in 2022, prices peaked in February of this year. And since then, we have seen a relatively rapid decline in prices. If we look at low-rise home prices, they peaked at just under 1.7 million. And today are kind of in the mid 1.4 range, and that's a very rapid decline. So a lot of people are thinking, okay, is the pattern that we're seeing today similar to what we saw in 2017? And it certainly is in the short term, but we want to be reluctant about sort of drawing parallels today to sort of what we saw 5 years ago, because the economic conditions today are fundamentally very different from what we saw in 2017. In 2017, the economy was strong. There was no recession, jobs were strong, interest rates were low, everything was great. It was just like this bursting of the housing bubble. Whereas today, it's not just like a bit of a bursting of the housing bubble. There are three big things going on that are very different from what we had 5 years ago. And the three factors are rapidly rising inflation, rapidly rising interest rates, and an economy where households have way more debt. They're more leveraged today than they were 5 years ago. Now, when we're trying to make decisions about our home buying decisions, I think it's important to at least have a general understanding of what's going on in our economy and how these different things might impact our economy in the future, potentially home prices in the future, because those might guide our real estate decisions. And while history never repeats itself, it often rhymes. And I think it's helpful to understand the conditions we're seeing today, which we haven't seen, quite frankly, in decades, to better understand how they might impact our housing market in the future, so we can make more informed decisions. So I'm going to unpack these three differences in our markets today from in the past and try to unpack how those might impact our housing market in the months and years ahead. So we're going to start off talking about inflation, and this is certainly something many of us have heard in the news, but we all might not have a very good understanding of what it is exactly and how it's measured and how it impacts our economy. Now, inflation, from the Bank of Canada's definition, is a persistent rise in the prices of the things that we consume. And the Bank of Canada and Statistics Canada measure this by taking an estimate of the typical things that people buy and spend their money on and trying to measure the rate at which those things are increasing. And for many of us, we see this every day in our lives. The cost of gas is increasing, the cost of food is increasing. Now, everything typically increases over time, but the Bank of Canada generally doesn't want prices rising much more than 2% per year. That's their approximate target, something in the 1% to 3% range, with 2% being the ideal. Now, the problem is that prices are actually rising about 7% per year right now, and some economists think that's even a conservative estimate. They think most people's kind of budgets are seeing prices actually rise much more rapidly than 7%. Now, why is a high inflation rate problematic for an economy? If we look at households, it's a significant problem because if we're on a fixed income and our income's not changing, well, every month that passes, our paycheck can buy fewer and fewer things. I mean, if the price of food's going up and the price of gas is going up and everything else is going up, we have a lot less money to spend on the things that we need in our lives. So it in particular impacts households who are not seeing an increase in their salaries because their purchasing power ends up declining over time, and especially if this ends up continuing over the next couple of years. But high inflation rate can also impact businesses as well, because businesses have a hard time budgeting for future projects. A lot of businesses who need to quote jobs that might not start for a year or 2 years, over the past few years, they've been able to make conservative estimates that prices aren't rising rapidly, whereas today, they're going to be far more reluctant and are in fact going to start quoting projects assuming prices are rising 7 or 8% per year because they want to be on the safe side and don't want to have to absorb those costs as well. So high inflation creates a lot of uncertainty both for households and for businesses. Now this next chart shows the CPI, basically the inflation index in Canada back from the 90s, and what we can see here is that this boom that we're seeing in inflation is sort of the highest rate we've seen in decades. And the one interesting thing is the last time we saw inflation this high was roughly in the 1990s. But the big difference between today and back in the 90s was back then, inflation started at roughly 4%, and over the span of about a year, it went up to 7%. Whereas this time, in 2022, we've seen inflation go from roughly 1% to 7% in a year. So it's a far more rapid rate of appreciation in sort of the price of goods, and that is having a material impact on our economy. And that's what we're going to talk about next, how the Bank of Canada tackles high inflation rates. So the Bank of Canada's key tool to fighting inflation is interest rates, and specifically their policy rate. Now, we see the impact of the Bank of Canada's changes in their policy rate on things like our line of credits and our variable rate mortgages. As the Bank of Canada increases their policy rate, the interest rate on our variable rate mortgages and our line of credits also increases with that. Now, the Bank of Canada's policy rate at the beginning of the year was 0.25%. It was unbelievably low, close to zero. And since then, they've made a number of rate increases. I mean, we're recording this video in the middle of June, and at the time, the Bank of Canada's policy rate now is 1.5%, and a lot of people expect them to raise that at least another 0.5%, if not another 0.75% by next month in July, which would push their policy rate over 2%. And many think they may push that up to 3% by the end of this year. So how does rising interest rates cool inflation? Now, the Bank of Canada, when we think about what is inflation, inflation is really fundamentally just an imbalance between supply and demand, right? There are too much money chasing too few goods, which is pushing prices higher. Now, the Bank of Canada can't do anything on the supply front. They can't create more oil, they can't create more food, they can't do anything on the supply side, but what they can do is try to cool demand, and that's effectively what higher interest rates do. When interest rates increase, people spend less. They basically, a lot of households who were maybe planning on doing a renovation and taking $100,000 out of their home equity line of credit to renovate their home, well, all of a sudden, if the interest rate on that line of credit is much higher, they might hit pause and not do that, and as more and more households start spending less money, this of course is going to put downward pressure on prices. I mean, if fewer people are renovating, it puts downward pressure on things like lumber and other material goods. So the way the Bank of Canada is trying to fight inflation, of course, is trying to pull a little bit of demand out of the market, which will hopefully ease prices. But of course, inflation is not just, the Bank of Canada doesn't have complete control of inflation. Inflation is also partly due to these global factors as well. And one big factor right now is the war in Ukraine. If the war in Ukraine comes to a close relatively soon, we might see a little bit more downward pressure on oil prices, on commodities and food prices, which will be good for the economy. But if it persists, we're probably going to see high oil prices and high food prices in our economy for the longer term, which will kind of force the Bank of Canada's hands to keep interest rates down because it's the only way they'll have to try to cool inflation. And as interest rates stay high, this is where sort of our third factor, which is very different from what we've seen in the past, starts playing a big role, and that is a high level of leverage in Canada's housing market. Since the start of COVID, Canadians have taken on a lot more debt, and they've taken on more debt, quite frankly, because this is what our policymakers told us to do. I mean, at the start of COVID, Bank of Canada Governor Tiff Macklem went out and said, get a mortgage, borrow. We're going to keep rates low for a very long time. And that is precisely what Canadians did. They went out and took a lot of mortgage debt. They renovated their homes. They took money out of their home equity lines of credit. And household debt in Canada is a lot higher today than it was 5 years ago. And we're certainly far more leveraged than even Americans to the south. And why does leverage and debt matter? Well, and in an environment when interest rates are rising rapidly, the people who get impacted the most, you have to imagine, are the people with a lot of debt. The household that has no mortgage is not going to be impacted by these higher interest rates, whereas the household that has a mortgage on their home and 3 investment properties all maxed out on debt are going to be far more exposed to these rapidly rising interest rates. And it's going to affect their cash flow and their monthly budget way more than if you have zero debt, right? And those are the two extremes, of course. And the Americans maybe are in the middle where they're not as leveraged as us, but they certainly obviously have a lot of debt. But when we think about an individual household, the ones with a lot of debt are going to be far more impacted by these rapidly rising interest rates. Now, the last thing I want to wrap up on is how do these 3 factors actually impact our housing market? So how does very high inflation, rising interest rates, and high leverage potentially impact our housing market? So let's first think about how rising interest rates impact the housing market. House prices are largely a function of interest rates. I mean, we saw this during COVID when the Bank of Canada lowered interest rates to practically 1.5% or 2% on mortgages. Home prices exploded. People could take on more debt. Homes were more affordable because interest rates were very low. Now, if we fast forward today, what does it look like for a household buying a home? Well, a household who bought a home a year ago can get a 5-year mortgage below 2%, but let's just, if we use 2% as a simple average, the monthly mortgage payment on $1 million mortgage a year ago was about $4,000. Now, if we fast forward to today, where interest rates are now above 5% for a 5-year mortgage, well, the mortgage payment on that same $1 million has gone from $4,000 a month to over $6,000 a month. Now, that's a huge difference because the household who bought that home and got a $1 million mortgage a year ago wouldn't actually even be able to buy that home in most cases today because their mortgage payment would be considerably higher. So the first way that high interest rates impacts the housing market is, and it's not just high interest rates, it's when interest rates rise rapidly. If we had gone from 2% to 5% interest rates over a 6-year term, we would not be impacted very much. The market has time to adjust. The reason the market is shifting so quickly is because we've gone from 2% interest to 5.5% interest rates in 12 months. And what happens is it kills demand because not as many buyers can afford today's elevated prices if they're paying significantly higher interest rates. And that's the first way these rapidly rising interest rates are impacting our market. In May of 2022 of this year, we saw the lowest volume of sales in 20 years, aside from the COVID-19 lockdowns in 2020, and we still haven't even felt the effects of these high interest rates. So the fall market's probably going to be very soft, and it's going to be soft because there's just not going to be a lot of buyers out there. So that's the first way these high rates are going to impact our housing market. The second thing to keep in mind is that the future path of interest rates is going to largely depend on where inflation is and how long inflation is with us, right? If the war in Ukraine ends soon and oil prices start declining and food prices start declining, we might see the soft landing that a lot of people are hoping for. Interest rate, the inflation will sort of start to slow down, and the Bank of Canada will be able to ease their interest rate path. But if inflation stays with us for a long time, well, high interest rates are going to stay with us for a long time. The Bank of Canada is going to have a hard time lowering rates, because lowering rates stimulates the economy. And even if we have a recession, they're going to have a hard time stimulating the economy with inflation so high, because the Bank of Canada's mandate is getting inflation back to 2%, right? So if inflation stays with us, high rates are going to stay with us for a long time. And this is sort of the last factor that I think we have to think about when we think about how all of these things combined can impact our economy. If high rates stay with us for a long time, well, this is potentially when we start to see distress among sellers. Because if we think back about sort of the third factor that is different today than 5 years ago, which is high leverage, right? And a lot of very indebted households can get by for 2 or 3 or 6 or maybe 12 months with high interest rate payments, and high costs. But if this sticks around for a long time, it's a lot harder for those highly indebted households to maintain all of their debt, right? And this is sort of the period in the cycle where you start to potentially see distressed sellers who needs to sell because they can't just hold on to their properties anymore. Prices have softened and they just need to get out of the market to basically ease their debt burden. And we don't know if we're gonna get there, but this is sort of how, if we do get to a deeper recession, that is the point where you might see some distressed sellers. We're not there yet, but if we get to that point, this is sort of how things might unfold. Now, I think the important thing for home buyers to take away from this and from sellers is it's important to keep our eye on sort of these broader trends, because I think it informs our decision making. But ultimately, when we think about when to buy, where to buy, what price to offer, all of these things, it's certainly the trends on the ground that are significantly more important. I mean, the broader macro trends are certainly important. They guide our decision making. They might tell us to hit pause potentially for a few months if we're not optimistic about the future, if we think prices might fall a little bit further. But ultimately, real estate is very local, and the price dynamics that impact one region or one house type are going to be different across even a metropolitan area like Toronto. Forget obviously the Canadian trends, but even within the GTA, what's happening downtown is very different from the suburbs. So what's going to be very important is to take a close look at the underlying dynamics in the neighborhoods that we're looking at, in the house types we're looking at. Are they slowing down further? Do we think we should hit pause and because we think there's a little more downward pressure on prices, or are they stabilizing? So these are the things I'm going to try to talk about in one of the upcoming videos. So I hope you found this video helpful. If you're looking for advice and guidance to navigate this volatile and challenging real estate market, you can click the link below to set up an appointment with me personally. For home buyers, I'm offering for a limited time a 50% off discount code for my home buyers bootcamp. The code's 50 off. And if you have any additional questions, please feel free to email me at askjohn@movesmartly.com.